Mahalo, everyone. Aloha. I want to, first of all, start by thanking Mark for getting in touch with me and providing me with this opportunity to meet with you to discuss some of the matters that we as an organization involve ourselves in. So I want to thank the Kokua Council for providing this opportunity to meet and discuss an issue that is very dear to my heart. And today I'm going to be talking about, for the most part, the act that was passed by the U.S. Congress in 1921, the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act, for the purpose of, quote, rehabilitating Native Hawaiians. And to understand the reason for the passage of that act, you have to go back, well, you don't necessarily have to, but I'm going to take you back in time to when Hawaii was a kingdom in the mid to late 1800s. And the impact that Western contact was having on life as a Hawaiian in Hawaii. In the 1840s, we have the introduction of private property rights in Hawaii. And prior to that, there was no such process for land in Hawaii. Land was looked at as a family member that Hawaiians would take care of because it would, in exchange, be taking care of Hawaiians. So the issue that presented itself in the 1840s was a person from England claiming ownership to a piece of land, and then a British ship coming here and overthrowing the Native Hawaiian government at that time. And the king at the time and his advisors were discussing how to deal with this issue, and they came up with a system that is not necessarily the same as the private property system you find on the continent. So in law school, when you take real property, you learn about all the bundle of rights that you obtain when you become a private property owner. And one of those sticks in the bundle of rights is the right to exclude, exclusivity. And that right doesn't necessarily apply in Hawaii if there are certain conditions that are met. And when I say that, I'm talking about whether someone can assert a right to access someone else's private property for certain traditional and customary practices, gathering, religious purposes, spiritual purposes. So when this issue is brought up during, that time of, it was a time of some real significant change in Hawaii. The king at the time wanted to make sure that his people were not going to lose their ability to survive in the land that they knew. Unfortunately, for the most part, that does not happen. And then we get to a point in history in the 1900s where Prince Kuhio becomes a delegate to Congress. And he is concerned about the decimation of the Hawaiian population and the ability for Hawaiians to live a lifestyle that they were comfortable with and knew about. And so he introduces the act to Congress. And It's been described as an act that was for the welfare or for the rehabilitation of Native Hawaiians to respond to the poverty and rapid decline of the Native Hawaiian population. And it was to establish a permanent land base for the beneficial use of Native Hawaiians, to provide Native Hawaiians with land upon which to develop homes, agriculture, farms, and ranches, and for the most part for the betterment of their conditions. So this becomes law in 1921. But there is really no vehicle for funding that program. There's really no obligation on the part of Congress to provide funding for the success of this program. I do want to quote Prince Kuhio when he addressed Congress. He said, "Of the Native Hawaiian right to land," he spoke as such, "perhaps we have a legal right, certainly we have a moral right to ask that these lands be set aside. We are not asking that what you are to do be in the nature of a largesse or as a grant, but as a matter of justice, belated justice." So we have a problem. Hawaiians in their own land are pretty much foreigners in that land. They're unable to live as they know in their own land, and the act is an attempt to try and turn that around. One of the things that happens in this act, though, is there is a requirement that someone has to be 50% blood quantum, and that has become a significant issue today as a result of having to prove you're 50% Hawaiian. And if you could show you were 50%, you could obtain a 99-year lease for $1 a year for residential, pastoral, or agricultural lots. So as I was saying, there's really no funding vehicle for this. And so there's really no movement in getting Hawaiians on the land through this act. And in 1959, as a condition of statehood, the state of Hawaii takes on the responsibility for ensuring that this act is carried out. But there's still no funding vehicle. And in 1978, at the Constitutional Convention, Article 12, Section 1 of the Constitution only provided that the state would provide the proceeds and income from Hawaiian homelands, and that money and additional sums may be used for the provision of services for the act. So what happens in 1978 are that the delegates, they provide an alternative, new language, and that would change the word may to shall. And so that is a proposed revision to the Constitution of the State of Hawaii. Article 12, Section 1 proposes a change of the word may provide sufficient funds to shall provide sufficient funds for the act, for everything that is covered by the act. And so that is voted on by the residents of the state of Hawaii in 1978, and it passes, and it becomes the amendment to the Constitution. So now that the Constitution reads that the state shall make sufficient sums available for four purposes, one of which is the administration and operating budget of the Department of Hawaiian Homelands. by appropriating that amount in the manner provided by law. So when you look at from 1978, after this becomes a part of the Constitution, up until the Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation is approached by beneficiaries of the act, asking us to represent them in a lawsuit to determine what that actually means. The state, for the most part, provides, if at anything, just nominal amounts of funding. And what happens is that the department has to use its own money from leasing out lands through their general lease program to non-Hawaiians. So they've got to take that money, which could have been used to put Hawaiians on the land, use that money to pay for their administrative and operating costs. In other words, pay their employees, make sure the maintenance of their offices, buy paper clips, all that stuff. All that money has to be used for that. So on behalf of these 5 plaintiffs, we file a lawsuit in state circuit court, and we argue that this is a constitutional requirement that the legislature has been violating for years. And it goes before the circuit court, and the state files a motion for summary judgment on the basis that this is a political question. In other words, the court can't determine it because it's out of their realm. And so the court agrees and dismisses the lawsuit, and we file an appeal. And that appeal goes to the Intermediate Court of Appeals, and the Intermediate Court of Appeals reverses the circuit court's decision and determines that there are standards by which the court can determine whether or not sufficient funds are being provided by the legislature to Hawaiian Homes to carry out the act. That decision gets appealed by the state to the Hawaii Supreme Court, and the Hawaii Supreme Court affirms the ICA's decision in part and reverses in part. And it finds that the sufficient sums for the administration and operating budget of the Department of Hawaiian Homelands is something that can be determined by a court. What is sufficient funding? But it determines that the other 3 purposes aren't covered. You don't have standards upon which you can determine how much money is needed. So Supreme Court provides that decision and remands to the circuit court again and says, circuit court, make a determination of what is sufficient sums for operating and administrative costs. And so in 2014, we go back down to the trial court, and just recently, end of 2015, early 2016, the court issues its decision based upon 2 weeks of trial, and the evidence presented determines that sufficient funding for Hawaiian Homelands for operating and administrative costs is around $28.4 million. And that sets off a firestorm in the legislature. Basically, legislators are arguing that the court has come into the legislative house and has not stayed in its own boundaries. In other words, there's what the legislature does and there's what the court does, and the court can't come into the legislature's house and tell them how to do things. So right now we have an issue that's in the legislature, and I think you have all probably heard about how the legislature is trying to deal with this issue. There's still a bill that needs to be needs to go to conference and then determine how much, if any, more money the legislature is going to provide to Hawaiian Homes for the current fiscal year, 2015, 2016. So we believe, based upon the Supreme Court's decision, that the court was within its rights to determine the specific amount. And so that's the position that we take, that legislature must provide at least $28.4 million. And if it did that, the department could use the money that it's been spending on administrative and operating expenses on actually getting people into homes. And when you look at the waiting list that we are currently under right now, which is almost 28,000 waitlisters, unless and until the state takes its constitutional duty seriously, we are going to continue to be in a position where what was intended by an act of Congress turns into just a pitiful, in my mind, pitiful example of how Hawaiians in their own home have been ignored, and pretty much turned into, politically without any real power to provide a way of, I keep on saying this, being Hawaiian in Hawaii. I think unless and until, like I said, the state is able to do what it said it would do at the time of statehood and after the Constitution was amended in 1978, it's just pitiful. I really have a hard time with, as a Hawaiian myself, it's like Prince Kuhio said, we're not looking for a handout. This is a moral, at a minimum, a moral obligation on the part of everyone that calls Hawaii home. And when it comes to how that really plays out in the state when it deals with the organization that I work for, the Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation, we become, the Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation, we become a target for cutting our funding, trying to disable our ability to provide the kinds of services that we do provide to Hawaiians. The way that we're funding is, through the most part, through the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. And what the Office of Hawaiian Affairs does is go to the legislature every biennium with their budget proposal, and in that budget proposal is a legal services proviso. And so they're asking, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs asks the state to match the trust funds for legal services. And so that's how the state is able to put pressure on the Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation to not do what it should do to enforce the laws of the state. And it's a pretty interesting dynamic that we have playing out here when it comes to these cases, Nelson, and other cases where we're seen as, you know, anti-development, anti-economy. And what I want to say right here and right now is the Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation is all about balance. It's looking at the laws of this state and the reason for the laws of this state, and it's trying to attempt to strike a balance between what is good for everyone here. And we believe what is good for the Hawaiian community is ultimately good for everyone that lives in this state. And so that's why I really have no problem doing the work that I do. You know, in my own personal experience, I was at one time apologetic for being Hawaiian because of the kinds of messages that I was taking in. And one of those messages was if I was going to amount to anything here, I was going to have to turn into the best American I could be. Because while my ancestors were very ingenious, creative, and, you know, were able to live here in one of the most remote areas of the world, that wasn't going to do me any good in today's society. And while I felt that on a surface level, deep down inside, I was fighting with that. And I didn't know how to deal with it. So the way I dealt with it was acting out and basically turning into what, you know, those people that we're providing those messages with said I was going to turn into. You know, I was going to eventually end up in prison. I was going to be uneducated, unemployed, all of the things that Hawaiians were number one in is what I was, you know, through my actions, going to end up becoming. I was fortunate enough to have an instance in my life and an opportunity to start looking at that in a very critical way and finding out why that was, that I was acting out like that. And I started to realize it was because of the way I looked at myself as a Hawaiian. I didn't have a firm grounding in what that was, so I didn't know who I was. And it was only after I started to look at that critically and seriously that I started to realize that I could be proud of being Hawaiian. And there were many things in Hawaiian culture and ways of knowing that were going to help me be the best person I could be in today's society. And that's what's gotten me to where I am with, you know, the organization that I'm with. I feel like I have gotten to the place that I was meant to be at, to be able to hopefully be an example for others that may be feeling the same way I do as a Hawaiian, and start to see that there's another way of dealing with life on its own terms. And so, I mean, that's really what these cases are all about for me, that the cases that we take are all about providing opportunity for Hawaiians to be Hawaiians in Hawaii and then ultimately for that to result in positive happenings for the entire society in these islands. So that's pretty much why I saw this opportunity as a real legitimate opportunity for me to reach out to others and to see if there's any way of being able to collaborate on the work that we do, or the work that may be similar in what the Kokua Council does and what the Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation does. And just to be able to have an opportunity to provide perhaps a different lens on Native Hawaiians, Native Hawaiian rights, the Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation. And so I really appreciate that. And ultimately, what I want to stress here is, my father was on the waiting list, and fortunately for him, he was able to get a lease before he passed. But he was on the list for 30 years before he got that lease. And there are others, like two of the members of the lawsuit, plaintiffs, passed away during this lawsuit, and one of them was never able to obtain a lease. And so there are, I think it's like 1,600 people on the wait list right now that have been waiting for 30 or more years. And one of the biggest hurdles is this funding issue. If there's additional funding that goes to Hawaiian Homes, there's this other pot of money opportunity that can, be used for the actual purpose of this act. And, I think it's way past time for us to make good on this promise to Hawaiians. And that's pretty much my message to you today. And mahalo for that opportunity. There's a question? Oh, so the question was, if there's 1,600 people on the wait list that have been waiting for 30 years, they're more than likely seniors, and that's correct. Well, you would think that there'd be more support from the state and the community for this act, this program, and why hasn't that happened? There's a lot of reasons that I can come up with, but I think the main issue has been the lack of power of Hawaiians themselves to make this an issue, and it wasn't until we brought this lawsuit that we started to get traction on this very issue. It just hasn't been something that's gotten a lot of traction because Hawaiians just haven't been able to get it into a discussion, community-wide discussion. It's I guess there's and as a Hawaiian myself, there's a lot of pride involved in, just from my own experience, my family, we're all survivors, and we're going to do what we need to do. And we don't complain. Ceded lands is a slightly different issue. Ceded lands are lands that were ceded to the U.S. by the territory, and they were crown and government lands. And those lands are now trust lands, and proceeds from those lands go to 20% of the proceeds go to the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, and DHHL gets some money from other lands. These lands are trust lands, and it's like 200,000 acres that were set aside at the passage of the act. So those lands are Hawaiian homelands, and they're not necessarily ceded lands. But those lands are, for the most part, pretty shabby lands. A lot of it is undevelopable. If you look at Papakolea, it's on the side of a mountain. A lot of it is rock. In order to get this act passed, there were some, the Prince Kuhio had to make some compromises. I think at the time of his, when he offered it, was like, as long as you could prove you were Hawaiian, in other words, you were a descendant of those that were here before before Western contact, then you would be eligible. And so this was negotiated, and it turned out that, they turned it into a 50% blood quantum. The 99-year lease, I totally agree with you. And it has repercussions today. Those things are all issues today. I mean, 50%ers are, they should have the first opportunity to get a lease. But at some point in time, there aren't going to be any 50%ers, and there needs to be a change in that. And it needs to, there needs to be a change in the blood quantum so that Hawaiians in general are able to take advantage of this act and this program. So the question is, how many leases, but you're asking more than that, how many move-in homes would be available every year at the current, right. So I think that what Hawaiian Homes has projected is that what they would shoot for is a year, hopefully around, and I may be totally off with this number, 300 new homes. And with the infusion of this additional funding, I think, they're looking at doubling or tripling that. When it comes to Hawaiians participating in political process, it is a number of factors are at play. I agree with you. It's, there's no sense. I mean, it's like a burnout. Nothing's going to change. Why should I be involved if nothing's going to change? Like I was saying in my family, I mean, and we have a very big family. My father came from a family of 26 children. And they, very early on in their lives, they knew what was going to be in store for them, and they worked. They were in grade school, and they were working on a farm, and they were doing chores, and they just didn't complain. I think, though, that it's starting to change. This in the 70s, there was a renaissance. We had Koho'olave. It started to, coalesce people being evicted from places that they were living. In the late 90s, and I think you may be aware of this, there was a bill that was in the legislature after a Supreme Court decision which determined that Hawaiians were entitled to a contested case when their tradition and customary practice were at issue. And after that decision came out, the business community, realtors, they were very concerned about it, and they were concerned that the value of their property was going to go down as a result of this decision. And there was a bill that went before the legislature. I remember Senate Bill 8, and it was, if any Hawaiian wanted to assert their tradition and customary rights, they were going to have to register that right. And if they didn't register it by a date certain, they were going to lose it. That brought out a bunch of very concerned people in the community, not just Hawaiians. And they camped out at the legislature for 3 days, and I guess it was 3 nights. And they were able to show the legislature that this was a significant bill that could have a huge impact. And Malama Solomon and I forget the other senator's name had to come down into the rotunda and talk to everyone and tore the bill up before everybody. So, you know, there are pressure points in the Hawaiian community, and we're hoping that we can provide turn this into one of those pressure points. We're planning a rally. It's going to be on April 18th at the legislature. Hopefully we're going to begin it at 9 o'clock and go till 1 o'clock. And we're going to have a number of people that are going to speak at that rally. But again, that's April 18th at the legislature. We're going to be providing more information on that in the very near future. We're going to start it at 9 a.m. in the morning. The question was, you know, Governor Ige, you would think he would be on the bully pulpit about this issue and making sure that the state's obligation was fulfilled. You know, there's a lot of power that he's dealing with, and I'm not trying to make an excuse for him. It's just, you know, we as a community, Hawaiians, I totally agree, we need to show legislators that we are not going to sit there and continue to be run over. We're not going to be silent anymore. We're going to speak out, and we're going to, you know, assert the rights that we have as a community. And you know, when it comes to that, you know, I think people see Hawaiian community in disarray, especially when we're talking about sovereignty and what should happen based upon history. And you know, I realize that has a tough effect when other people see that and they say, why can't you guys just get along? And what my response is, we have, you know, I was in a case once, and I was an attorney representing this organization, and what happened was the other side brought in Hawaiians to make the counter argument against what our concern was. And so we created the Hawaiian versus Hawaiian claim. And, you know, it was something that was of no benefit to Hawaiians. It was, you see, they just fight with each other. Well, what I began to understand was that we wouldn't have been in this position as Hawaiians if certain things in history had not occurred. So we were placed there by events that were pretty much out of our control, and then we become antagonists with each other. And I think that our anger is directed in the wrong direction, and and that's what we're trying to do, get to a point where we start to see that other Hawaiians are entitled to their opinion and their concerns, and that's just how it is because of what's happened in history. But ultimately, we need to direct our energy in a very positive and optimistic way, and we can continue to disagree with each other, but there are certain things that I know we can agree on, and that is the welfare of Hawaiians. Let's work on bringing the level of welfare, in the Hawaiian community up. And once again, thank you very much for this opportunity.